My husband Raymond told me, the night before I filed for divorce, that I would end up alone in some sad little apartment eating canned soup and watching the clock. He said it the way he said most things, not yelling, not dramatic, just matter of fact, like he was reading a weather report. "Harriet, you don't have the first idea how to survive on your own. You never have." I was 61 years old when he said that to me. I had been married to my husband Raymond for 32 years. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a woman who gives up easily. I raised 2 children mostly by myself while Raymond worked, traveled, criticized, and disappeared into whatever version of himself he preferred that week. I kept that house. I kept that family. I volunteered at the church. I drove the carpool. I made the casseroles when the neighbors lost somebody. And I showed up to every school play and every parent-teacher conference and every single Little League game, even when it rained. I did all of that. And Raymond, my husband, Raymond, looked at me one Tuesday evening in our kitchen and told me I did not know how to survive. So let me tell you what happened next. I need to go back a little, because the edge of something long is never just one moment. It builds. It accumulates like water damage inside a wall. You don't see it until the whole structure starts to give. Raymond and I met when I was 28. He was 33, already working in commercial real estate, confident in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be confident. I thought that certainty was attractive. I was young enough to mistake control for protection. The first years were fine. Not perfect, but fine. We had our daughter, my sweet Noelle, and then 3 years later our son, my boy Clifton. Raymond worked hard and I worked harder at everything the paycheck didn't cover. When the children were small, Raymond would come home and find dinner on the table, and he would sit down and eat and talk about his day and not ask about mine. I used to tell myself that was just how it was. That was just what men of his generation did. My own mother had told me, men provide, women manage. I believed it for a long time. But something in Raymond's manner toward me changed as the years went on. The early indifference became something sharper. He started commenting on how I spent grocery money. Not big amounts. I mean $30, $40 here and there, things I needed for the house or for the children. He would look at the receipt and sigh in this particular way, this long, slow exhale that was somehow more cutting than any word, and then he would say something like, "Harriet, do you understand how hard I work for this?" I understood. I understood very well. Because it understand yet. What I didn't understand yet was that no amount of understanding would ever be enough for him. By the time Noelle and Clifton were in high school, Raymond had stopped asking my opinion about almost anything. Not dramatically. He would still include me in conversations, at dinner parties, still introduced me to his colleagues as his wife, with something that looked like pride. But at home, privately, my voice had become background noise to him. I would suggest something, a family vacation, a small renovation, a different approach with Clifton, who was struggling in school. And Raymond would either dismiss it outright or simply not respond, the way you don't respond to a television you've left on in another room. I remember the Christmas I asked if we could visit my sister Paulette in Georgia. My sister Paulette had been asking us for 3 years. Her husband had died the previous spring, and she was alone, and I missed her. Raymond said we couldn't afford the flights. 2 weeks later, I found a receipt for a golf weekend in Scottsdale. 4 nights, 5 men, the kind of resort where the drinks cost more than our weekly groceries. I didn't say anything. That was the worst part. I had learned by then not to say anything. What I did instead was start a small garden in the backyard. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't a plan. I had always loved growing things. My grandmother had kept a garden, and I had spent summers with her as a girl, kneeling in the dirt, learning which plants needed shade and which needed sun, and how to read the soil by how it felt in your fingers. When the children were small, I had kept a few tomato plants and some herbs by the back fence, but Raymond thought it looked untidy, and I let it go. Now Clifton was 15, and Noelle was 18, and something in me needed somewhere to put my hands. I started with a 4x8 raised bed along the back fence, then another, then a small cold frame for starting seeds in February. I grew vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, kale, but also flowers. Because I had always loved flowers, and because Raymond had never specifically told me not to, and that small loophole felt like something. Zinnias, dahlias, sweet William, rows of lavender that smelled like a different life. My neighbor across the back fence, a woman named Claudette O.C., who had moved from Accra to Atlanta 20 years ago and kept one of the loveliest yards on the street, started coming to the fence to talk. Claudette was warm and direct and funny in a dry way that I loved immediately. She grew her own things: ground nuts, garden eggs, bitter leaf, and she knew more about plants than anyone I had ever met. We started talking over the fence in the mornings, and then having coffee on her porch, and then slowly comparing notes on what we each grew and what we couldn't get right. It was Claudette who first said, "Harriet, you have a gift for this. Do you know what your dahlias are worth?" I laughed. I told her I didn't grow them to sell. She looked at me with that level, patient look she had and said, "I didn't ask why you grew them. I asked if you knew what they were worth." I didn't know it then, but that question was a door. The year Clifton graduated high school and left for college in Nashville was the year I stopped pretending. I don't mean I stopped trying. I tried for another 6 years after that. I suggested counseling twice, and Raymond said we didn't need a stranger telling us how to live our lives. I tried being quieter, then being warmer, then being more direct. I tried the advice in the books I read after Raymond went to sleep. Books I kept in my nightstand and read with the lamp on the lowest setting so he wouldn't ask what I was reading. None of it changed anything fundamental. What had changed so gradually I almost didn't notice was me. The garden had grown. I had expanded it to nearly a quarter of the backyard by then, and I was growing specialty cut flowers: garden roses, lisianthus, ranunculus, dahlias in 12 varieties, that I was selling at the Saturday farmers market in our neighborhood. I had started small, just a folding table and some buckets, nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous since I was a young woman. But the flowers sold. They sold so consistently that I had a waiting list by my second season. People came back every week. A woman named Sylvia. Oh, wait! I cannot use that name. Let me say, a woman who ran a small event planning business started buying from me regularly and then asked if I could supply flowers for a wedding. I said yes before I had decided I was going to say yes. The wedding was for 60 guests in a garden venue outside the city. I drove there at 5 in the morning with my van. I had bought a used cargo van with money I had been quietly saving for almost 2 years. A little at a time from the farmer's market, tucked into an account Raymond did not know about. And I unloaded 12 buckets of flowers and arranged them with my own hands. And when the mother of the bride cried looking at the ceremony arch I had built with peach garden roses and white sweet peas, something cracked open in my chest. Not sadness, something more like recognition. Raymond found out about the van when he saw the insurance notice. He was not pleased. "What exactly is this?" He stood at the kitchen table with the paper in his hand and that expression. Not quite angry, more like disappointed in a way that was meant to make me feel foolish. "It's a vehicle I purchased," I said, "for my business." "Your business?" He said it the way you say words in a language you find ridiculous. "My flower business, Raymond. I've been selling at the market for 3 years. With what money? With the money I earned." He sat down slowly. "Harriet, I support this family. You don't need to be running around selling flowers out of a van like—" He stopped himself, but I heard the end of that sentence in the pause. "Like what?" I asked. He shook his head and picked up his phone. "Done with the conversation. Done with me." That night, I lay in the dark beside him, and I thought about my grandmother's garden, and about Claudette's face when she first looked at my dahlias, and about the mother of the bride weeping at a ceremony arch I had made with my own hands, and I thought about a woman eating canned soup in a sad little apartment, and I found that I was not afraid of that woman. I found, if I was honest with myself, that I was not afraid of her at all. 3 months later, I told Raymond I wanted a divorce. He laughed first. Then he went quiet. Then he said the thing about the apartment and the soup and not knowing how to survive. And I looked at my husband of 32 years, and I said, very calmly, "I guess we'll find out." I want to be honest about the next part because these stories have a way of skipping over the hard middle and jumping straight to the triumph. And that has always bothered me. The hard middle is where the real story is. The divorce took 14 months. Raymond had resources and he used them. He hired a lawyer who specialized in making proceedings expensive and slow, which I learned is a specific strategy. You wear the other person down until they accept less than they're owed just to be done with it. He also had a habit of seeing me on things at inconvenient hours and making me feel, through the entire process, like I was a problem he was managing, rather than a person ending a marriage. My own lawyer was a woman named Beverly. I chose her specifically because Raymond had suggested I use a man he knew from his golf circle, which told me everything I needed to know. Beverly Crane was 63, 2 years older than me, and she had been practicing family law for 31 years. She had a way of listening that made me feel like every word I said mattered, which was not something I had experienced in a long time. "He's going to argue you have no income to speak of," Beverly told me in our second meeting. I slid 3 years of farmers market ledgers across her desk, plus the invoices from 8 wedding events, plus the tax return I had filed as a sole proprietor, which Raymond had not known about because we had stopped doing our taxes together 4 years prior. Beverly looked at those papers for a long moment and then looked at me with something that might have been amusement. "He doesn't know about any of this, does he?" "No," I said. "He never asked." What followed was difficult. I won't pretend it wasn't. I moved out of the house in February into a 2-bedroom rental in a neighborhood I didn't know well. A perfectly decent apartment, I will tell you, with good light and a small balcony where I immediately put 4 planters of winter herbs. But the first month I was there alone, I cried almost every evening. Not for Raymond. I want to be clear about that. I cried for the version of my life I had believed in for 32 years. I cried for the woman I had been at 28, so certain she was building something permanent. I cried for all the Tuesday evenings I had swallowed what I wanted to say, but I did not cry on the Saturday mornings. On Saturdays, I loaded the van and drove to the market and set up my table and talked to my customers, and came home with an empty van and a full cash box. That part of my life felt, even then, more real than most of what I had left behind. Claudette called me every Sunday. My daughter Noelle, who had moved to Charlotte 2 years before with her husband, called me twice a week and drove up for a long weekend in March and helped me hang curtains and rearrange furniture. And we stayed up until 2 in the morning, drinking wine and talking the way we had not talked since she was a teenager. She cried a little, telling me she had known for years something was wrong. I held her hand and told her the truth, that I was going to be okay, that I was more than okay. My son Clifton took longer to come around. He was 24 by then and idolized his father, in the way that younger sons sometimes do, the way that has more to do with wanting an image of strength than with actually knowing someone. He didn't call me for 2 months after I moved out. When he finally did, I didn't make him apologize. I just told him I loved him, and that the door was always open, which was the truth. By summer, he was visiting. By fall, he was on my side, not in a bitter way, but in the way a young man finally sees his mother as a person. The settlement came through in April, 14 months after I had said, "I guess we'll find out." I received the equity from the house, a portion of Raymond's retirement accounts that Beverly had worked methodically to identify and document, and the legal right to my business, which Raymond's lawyer had tried to argue was a hobby, right up until Beverly laid those tax returns on the table and watched them go quiet. I 62 years old. I had an apartment with good light and 4 planters of herbs on the balcony, and a used cargo van, and a business that fit in a ledger I kept in the kitchen drawer. I had about enough money to breathe for 3 years if I was careful, and a farmer's market waiting list of 47 people, and an inbox with 9 unanswered inquiries from event planners who had seen my work at weddings. I answered every one of those emails the week the divorce was final. I am not going to pretend I knew what I was doing, because I didn't. I had never run a real business. I had done bookkeeping for Raymond's office in our early married years, and I knew how to read a profit and loss front statement, but building something from the ground was different. There were decisions I got wrong, a supplier I trusted who turned out to be unreliable, a hiring mistake I had to correct after 3 painful months. I signed a lease on a small greenhouse space east of the city, and then worried about it every night for the first 6 months. But I also had things I hadn't expected. I had Claudette, who had by then become one of my closest friends, and who had quietly been growing specialty flowers herself for a decade, and who agreed to come on as a partner. Not with money, but with knowledge, which turned out to be worth more. I had my daughter Noelle's marketing background, which she offered on weekends for the first year, because she believed in what I was building. I had my own stubbornness, which Raymond had always called a flaw, and which I was learning to call a foundation. And I had something I had not anticipated. Time. Not free time. I worked harder than I had worked in my life. But time that was mine, answerable to no one but me and my customers. I made decisions and I lived with them, and I made better decisions. I learned what I was good at, which turned out to be more things than I had been told. By the end of my second year operating as a real business, not a farmer's market table, but a licensed floral design studio called Quiet Stem. I was supplying flowers to 14 events per month and 3 boutique hotel lobbies that rotated arrangements on a bi-weekly basis. I had a part-time assistant named Wren, who was 26 and had a better eye for color than anyone I'd met, and who made me feel, in the best way, like I was running something real. By the end of my third year, the gross revenue from Quiet Stem had passed $200,000. I sat at my kitchen table the night my accountant called me with that number, and I stayed very still for a long time. Not crying, not laughing. Just sitting with it, the way you sit with something that takes a moment to become real. I thought about a Tuesday night in a kitchen, a man with a receipt in his hand, and that long, slow exhale. I thought about 32 years of swallowed words and invisible work. I thought about the van I had bought in secret, and the ledger I had kept in a drawer, and the emails I had answered the week. The divorce was final. I thought he never asked. He never once asked what I was worth. I heard about Raymond through Clifton, who was not trying to deliver news, but was just talking, the way children do when they've stopped dividing their parents into separate compartments. Raymond had, apparently, made some investments in the 2 years after our divorce that had not performed the way he had been told they would. A development project he had backed in a partnership with 2 other men had collapsed. Not dramatically, just slowly, the way things collapse when everyone involved is too proud to admit the problem early. He had also sold the house in a buyer's market and bought into a condominium development that was still incomplete 18 months past its projected date. I didn't feel what I had expected to feel, hearing this. I thought I might feel a sharp satisfaction, the kind you see in movies, the wronged woman finding out the man who underestimated her has been humbled. What I actually felt was something quieter. A kind of release. A letting go of something I had been holding without realizing it. I did not call Raymond. I had nothing to say to Raymond. What I did that evening was drive out to the greenhouse and walk through it alone, which I did sometimes when I needed to think. It was late September, and the dahlias were at their peak. I had 34 varieties by then, in colors that ran from pale ivory to a deep burgundy that looked almost black at dusk. The air smelled like green things and good dirt, and somewhere underneath that faintly, something sweet. I walked the rows and put my hands on the plants the way my grandmother had taught me. Not to check them, just to know them, just to be there. I thought about the question Claudette had asked me all those years ago at the back fence. Do you know what your dahlias are worth? And I thought about how long it had taken me to understand that she wasn't asking about money. Not only about money, she was asking if I knew. I turned 65 last spring. Noelle drove up with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, and we had a dinner that went until nearly midnight, and my son Clifton came in from Nashville with the woman he is going to marry. A steadfast, perceptive young woman named Augusta who reminds me, in the best ways, of the person I was trying to be at her age. We ate at a long table on my back porch, the same porch where I have been having my morning coffee for 3 years now, looking out at the garden I keep at this house, bigger than the last, with a cutting garden that I tend myself on the days I'm not at the studio. Claudette was there. Beverly Crane was there. Wren came with her boyfriend and stayed until the end and helped clean up, which I had not asked her to do. I looked around that table. Sometime around 11 o'clock, when the candles had burned down and the children were asleep inside, and the adults were still talking, unhurried, in the way you can only talk when there is no one waiting for you to be done. And I thought about the woman my husband had described. The woman eating canned soup alone, watching the clock. She was not at my table. I was not that woman. I had never been going to be that woman. But it had taken leaving to know it with the certainty I know it now. I am not going to tell you the divorce was easy, or that starting over at 61 is something everyone can do the same way, or that money solves the thing that actually hurt, which was not money at all. What hurt was 32 years of being looked past. What healed was 32 years of work that turned out to mean something. Once I stopped apologizing for it. Raymond told me I didn't know how to survive without him. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to find out, was that I had been surviving in spite of him for a very long time. All I did was stop. Quiet Stem now supplies flowers to 22 regular clients, employs 4 people including Ren, and, this past March, opened a second location. Claudette is still my partner. The dahlias are still my favorite. The cargo van has 212,000 miles on it, and I will drive it until it quits. I am 65 years old. I wake up in the morning in a house I chose, in a life I built, answerable to no one but my own conscience and my customers. I have good coffee and a garden I know by heart, and 2 children who call me regularly, and a granddaughter who asks to help me plant seeds, which I take as a sign that something is being carried forward. I don't know if Raymond is watching. I don't think about it much. But if he is, I hope he sees the dahlias.